Hi, I am Iris Ivana, CEO of the Genesi Group, and I am here speaking to a woman that I not only love as a personal friend, but I honor and respect highly as a professional, Dr. Nsenga Burton, and she is the founder and CEO of the Burton Wire Media Group. And if you don't know about her, you need to know. Hi, Nsenga.
Hey, Iris, thank you for having me on. I appreciate you.
Oh, no, I love having you on. I love having you on. I think this is going to be a great conversation. One of the things that we wanted to talk about in light of all of the changes that are happening in our country this year, but particularly in the last 48 hours, when we're talking about things that are happening on the political trail, on the political campaign, and fundraising, and how fundraising and journalism, which is that narrative, that story, how they connect, how they tie together. And so we just wanted to come and have some conversation today so that we can kind of enlighten people on some things that they may or may not know that are important when you're talking about fundraising in any spectrum, in any realm, for any industry, any business, nonprofit, any kind of campaign, and how that ties and bonds to the work that we do, not just in the industry for fundraising, but in when you're talking about media and you're talking about the importance of media and journalism and the story and the narrative, whether that's about an individual or as we have this great political debate in our democracy going on right now.
Mhm.
So here we are, and I couldn't have asked for a better person to come on today. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to talk about fundraising, whether you talk about small businesses, whether you talk about fundraising, that's done in the political space. There's been a lot of talk about, President Biden stepping out of the race, and then what happens to the money that's raised by his donors, what happens to that PAC. There's been some misinformation out there, like, oh, he's just going to give it to Kamala Harris, who's looking like she's going to become the nominee for the Democratic Party. But there's a lot that's going on behind the scenes. It's not just Joe Biden said that this is going to happen, so this is going to happen. There is a process and a procedure at play. So I think it's important for people, the general public, to understand how that works, so that if this happens again, then they know what's happened. And since it is happening now in real time, they have a better understanding and the context around which these decisions are being made and how donors are being impacted by this as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it is important to note and remember, and this is one of my personal and professional pet peeves, is that people don't understand that fundraising is a profession and that there are agreements and MOUs, memorandums of agreement, memorandums of understanding that happen. There are gift policies and gift procedures. And so when someone gives, and it's a direct ask to support me, to support my business, invest in my business, support my idea, support my campaign, um, support me running for a specific, does not just have to be in a political office, but for any kind of campaign that someone might be pursuing. It's important to know that that dialogue, that relationship is tied to that ask. And so the give is tied to that ask, and it cannot just be moved, whether it's, if you're talking specifically for nonprofits, if a donor gives to a particular program, we've got to go back to that donor and say, hey, we can or cannot meet this deliverable and why. This is what you intended for these funds. But then you have to kind of start that process again of understanding and agreement and discovery of the changes, and then have them sign on to that, right? Verbally, written in a written component. And we see that more often sometimes in a higher level of giving, but every donation counts, every investment counts. And that relationship and that rapport is critical in a system that works across industries, across verticals, behind the scenes.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's part of. I think sometimes people don't think that fundraising is a job, like a profession, is because it is done so much kind of behind the curtain. And so when people hear about it, it's usually like, hey, Oprah Winfrey donated $25 million to Morehouse College. Hey, this person donated such and such or whatever, but they don't see the years that it took, right, to get that to happen. They don't see all of the events and the programs and the planning that it took to get that to happen. Oh, so and so won this grant. They don't know that it takes at least 2 years to get a grant even in process, and then to get it done, and then to have the money actually come to you, and how that works. And sometimes, you have to put the money up front and you get reimbursed. Like, it really just depends on the grant, right? So I think that part of the reason that people don't know or don't have the respect, the healthy respect they should have for fundraising, particularly in the nonprofit world, is because they really don't have real insight into what goes on behind closed doors in those particular spaces.
That is so true. And talk to us just a little bit about like your experience in that space, because people also don't realize that there are different types of fundraising mechanisms. You
Hmm.
know, there's friend raising, there's raising by relationship, there's strategic philanthropy, there is, like you said, there are grants, there are investments, there are investment funds. There are so many different ways to do it. And I think that been a little bit of a tarnish or diminish on the profession itself, because we are also in the age of crowdfunding.
Hmm.
We're
Hmm.
also in the age of, mobile app and text giving. But there's a strategy behind things, there's a process, and there is legalese behind it, right? Tell us a little bit about your experience in that space, and maybe one or two of the things that you find that people are missing is a true misinformation about what happens behind the scenes on those kinds of things.
Well, fundraising, I mean, I've done it for myself, my business, and I've also done it for other organizations. Particularly, I was a professor for 20, 22, 23 years. And so I've been part of a billion grants teams, grants writing teams. And so typically grants, one thing people don't understand is, somebody will come up to you and say, hey, there's this grant out there. Can you do it? And it's like, yeah, but you do know that grants are done, it's a collaborative process. I mean, I could do it. And there are some people who are like what I call killers. Sorry, don't want to be violent. That's what I call them, killers. Like, there's like three people, you're one of them, who you could be like, okay, here's this grant that's usually going to take somebody else 10 months to do. But because you've been doing it so long and you're so good at it, you could do it by yourself and get it done in 3 months. So we're going to hire you to get this grant done, get this grant application in. You have the relationships, you have the whatever that we need to get us over the hump to hopefully be a real contender for this grant. There's some killers out there. Most people are not. Most people, it's a collaborative process. You have a grants writing team. Everybody takes a part of said grant, and then you come together and you bring your different parts together and synthesize it and then apply. Okay, so that's typically how grants work. It's not just one person doing them. In fact, you're less likely to get funded if it's one person doing them, because one of the things that you do writing grants is ideate, and you have to figure out the ways in which not only you would use the grant money, and it's usually a bunch of guidelines that you have to adhere to and follow, right? But you also have to think about the ways in which you're going to write the grant together. And that's difficult to do. Strategic planning is difficult to do because of that, right? Because you have a bunch of different people trying to come together. Everybody's got to be on deadline. You ask for feedback, you don't get feedback. Then you got to still move it forward. And then people are mad because the feedback's not included.
Ooh,
You
tell me about it. Tell me about it.
all of these things happen when it comes to grant writing, strategic plan, all those things, and grants and strategic planning work hand in hand. So that's why I brought that up. And so, it's a really, really complicated process. It's not easy. So because you see like someone won a Guggenheim, or they got this type of award, or they got a melon. Some of them, they got $50,000 grants, and I'm not trying to be smug or anything, but it's 50,000. That's usually a 3 page application, and then you got to do some other stuff or whatever. But if it's 5 million, that's probably a 30-page application. You got to put some other things in it. You got to have a whole team, like who's going to help manage this grant? How's this going to happen? Do you have the people in place to do it? Do you have the money to pay those people who are in place to do it? You have to prove a lot of things in place. So one thing I want to demystify is the fact that grants are easy. People are like, oh, just get a grant. I mean, if it was that easy, everybody would be getting them. Grants are not easy to get. There's
No.
not a lot of money out there. Most people are competing for the same dollars. And that's my next example, are competing for the same dollars in the marketplace. Um, and grants, it's a marketplace. I mean, it is. We don't think
Mhm.
about it that way because a lot of it's like it's nonprofit, or, it's tax free if you're a particular nonprofit or trade organization or what have you. But it's a marketplace. And so people are competing for those same dollars. And as the market grows, you have more people competing for fewer and fewer dollars. So that's something I think people have to think about when they think about grants. They think it's one person, they think it is, endless money, amounts of money, and they don't
Yes,
really
they do.
the competitive nature of it. Um, the next part about funding, I would say as an entrepreneur, um, is that a lot of funding is locked up in the hands of like 98% of people. 98% of the funding is locked up in the hands of 2% of those who are going after. Like if we're talking about venture capital is when you have an idea and you have these groups of people and they have money, and it might be a billionaire who has their own money. It could be, a collective of 25 people who are all coming into a fund and donating a certain amount of money. But there are different types of venture capital funds that you can try to get funding from to help move your venture forward, right, to the next stage of growth, right? If you're trying to scale a business, perhaps, or if you're trying to, if you watch Shark Tank, you'll see that, where people will be trying to get money to go to the next level, so to speak. And that could be in sales, it could be in staff, it can be in production. There are lots of different
Mhm.
categories. But this idea that, venture capital is out there for everyone. It is not. It is locked up in the hands of literally, I would say it's 1%, but statistically it's 2%. It feels like 1%.
It does.
And it's mostly the people who don't look like us. There are men. It's usually white men. It's usually white men of a certain age who have access to most of that money, who have it to give, A, and have access to it, B. And so this idea, you see a lot of um, ads that are showing, dynamic people of color with their businesses, which is great. We want everybody in Target. We want everybody wherever they can be. We want you to have your pop-ups, all the things. But it is not really reflective of the reality of the funding that is available, especially venture capital funding that is available to small businesses owned by Black people in general. Oh, well, I would say people of color in general, but and Black women specifically, because you see a lot of Black
Mhm.
women because we set the trends, right? We're in the ads because we're on social media. But
Very
that is
true.
not
Very true.
reflective of the truth. So even though the ads you see seem like, oh, it's a bunch of people, honey, they're just doing wonderful things, which is great, and they are. Then you have
They
the
are.
Fearless Fund that's getting sued for trying to give people $25,000 grants, right?
Mhm.
So I think that people need to be less dazzled by their presence in media, right? You see articles, you see this, you see that, and look at the reality and look at the data in terms of who is getting funding and who isn't, and who is making legislation to stop certain people like Black women from getting funding. It's not, we're proud of everyone who wins. We want everybody to win, but the wins are not reflective of the number of people who are trying to enter the marketplace and trying to build businesses and create generational wealth for their families. The money's just really not out there. Well, it's out there. It's just not being made available to us, even when we are qualified. So
Mhm.
that's
That
it.
accessibility part.
Yes.
Yeah,
So I know that was
absolutely.
long. I'm sorry, that was a lot, but
No, you are good. You are so good because people need to think these things through, especially as entrepreneurs, especially as we're talking about social entrepreneurs, we're talking about foundation leaders, and we're talking about the shift that's happening in this
Mhm.
country, economically, politically, even with corporate social responsibility, there's a shift, right? And so the reality is, how do you think through the shifts when you don't know all the backdoor behind the scenes working of the industry, of the mechanism? It will, one, either give you fear, right? Or you'll kind of be in this space where you think that it'll never happen to you, right? Because some people that are being funded now for things are realizing, oh, their legs are being chopped a little bit because
Mhm,
funding in all of those buckets, in all of those areas is shifting,
mhm.
right? And they don't realize what shifts fundraising, whatever type of fundraising you're doing, whatever capital raise you're doing, these things shift the momentum, it shifts the access. It was like you said, there's never an issue with the money. The money's there, even if it's hidden in a little bucket somewhere, money
Mhm.
is there, whether you have the acknowledgement or the knowledge and the access to it, the relationship to have it, and have access to it. The power brokers that be have that access. And it is not always access that we are made available. And sometimes when we're made to have an understanding of it, then the goal line is moved.
Yes.
Okay? The grant narrative changes, the strategy changes. And it happens across the board, right? And so when the goalpost is moved, then you've got to navigate that, and you've got to think about it in space of what's best for you, best for your organization. I love that you talked about the grants because people don't realize the manpower required. The larger the grant, the more manpower, the more FTEs that you have to have, the more full-time employees you have to have for the
Mhm.
reporting system to report out on what you've done in capacity in the program for the grant, right? And that may not be covered in the grant. So you may
Yeah.
spend a portion of money, right,
Yes.
to report on the report, right? For the money that you've gotten. And that's outside of the parameters of what you may be able to afford or what the grant allows for. Now you've got to go out, find a person, find the money to hire the person to report on the money that you just got. It's kind of crazy, the system, right?
Well,
But
Ira,
people don't realize that.
yeah, and one thing, I mean, that's a great point that you raised, and that was the other thing I was going to say. There is reporting with grants. So you don't just get this money, it's not just tax free, and then you get to do with it whatever you want. That's what the commercials make it look like. It's not that. You have to report like measurable income outcomes, rather. I'm sorry, measurable income,
Mhm.
measurable outcomes. And it has to be data driven in order to justify the grant. Because in some grants, if you don't do it, you got to give that money back. And also, if you are in like a multi-year grant, right, where there's a large pot of money, they give you some now, and then you have to reapply for, and part of the reapplication process is to give them measurable outcomes from what you've done the year prior. If you don't have that data, you're definitely not getting funded again for that next year. And so I think that's important. You raise a great issue that uh report part. A lot of people don't talk about it, they don't think about it. Like it's more than, oh wow, we got this money. Yes. Yeah, that's great. But now you have to track every single thing that you're doing. You have to be able to measure every single thing that you're doing. You have to have those benchmarks in place and be clear with your grantor, that this, qualifies as such. And then you have to report that out so that you can justify having gotten that money. And
Mhm.
then sometimes getting more of that money from that person. So,
Mhm. And that's a great space that you brought on that up with that because um that leads to narrative,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
right? That leads to the story. And so people get so tied up in the story. Um I would be bewildered when I would see I don't want to be cautious. I don't want to like I'm not trying to point anybody out in this, but you would see the ads during the holidays and they always were in some third world country, and it was always the child that needs the meal, or the family that's without this, and it's the same line and the same narrative. And although the story is real, when it comes to impact, it is less about the story and it becomes a numbers game,
mm-hmm,
right? And so that's when you're getting into the different levels of, even when you're trying to get fundraising or you're raising capital, the narrative changes once the hands of the money has been exchanged. I'm no
exactly.
longer pulling your heartstrings to get and to drive, right, the support I need. But once I get that support, they're deliverables, right?
Mm-hmm,
And those deliverables are numbers, percentages, right? It's a
mm-hmm.
different kind of narrative, right? Because they want some kind of impact, some kind of number, some kind of bottom line. It's just the reality of it. And let's talk a little bit about the narratives and the importance of journalism, because you are brilliant in journalistic perspectives and views. And I want to take that a little bit because we got a little bit of like the power play that happens between corporate giving and people giving.
Mhm,
It's a
mhm.
huge different dynamic. And the narrative, the story of what people see, especially when people are getting their news and their media from social media. There, and I was talking to a friend earlier today, and he was making a comment about, certain family members that do not like actually look at the news or read the news. They look at what they get off of TikTok or what they get off of social media as their journalistic view, right? And it impacts how they give and what they give to. Just tell us a little bit about, I really want to hear your perspective on how journalism and how that story impacts even where we are today, how people are motivated to give or to move or to not move, right?
Yeah,
Because we're talking about access,
yeah.
right? So it limits your access.
Yeah, one of my friends, colleagues, we talk about a lot of people talk about the George Floyd effect. That's the biggest example, recent example of giving, right? And so after the George Floyd murder, and the conviction of the police officer who murdered him, there was this onslaught of giving that was coming not only from individuals but from corporations, and so forth. And it was a really busy time, energetic time of giving. But I think the narrative of what happened to George Floyd and the way that was told in the media, because it was so they were so transparent and people were so taken aback, by just the violence of it based on nothing but who he was, a poor black man, right? That they felt like they had to do something about it. And so it's like, what am I going to do? I'm not going to march. I'm not going to host an event necessarily. Um, but what I can do is help fund an organization that's already doing this social justice work. What I can do is help create entrepreneurship centers, so that we can create more entrepreneurs and people can have better control over their financial, economic, emotional, legacies, all those things. What I can do is give more money to scholarships, right? To So that people can learn more about social justice, and so that people can have a better opportunity to join the workforce at levels where they can potentially afford to take care of themselves, right? I mean, there's a lot of that, and a lot of what happened with George Floyd is tied to the giving that was done or that happened. And the charitable giving that happened during that, I would say over the last 4 years, 5 years maybe. What's interesting though is in the same way that the narrative, especially in journalism, worked, because it was just great coverage of that story, and a lot of the coverage was empathetic. So
Yes.
what it normally is, which is like demonization of Black people, vilification of Black people. There was some of like, what was he doing on certain channels? But for the most part, most people were just outdone at what happened and what they saw. And so it was, told from a point of empathy. This Black man called out for his mom when he was dying. Was Had a small child, was a father, all the things, a brother. And was taken out in that way, and it's not like we hadn't seen it before, right? But it was this particular case in this particular moment, that in that it struck a nerve, and it tied directly to the charitable giving community. Conversely, you now have these narratives, and we were talking about this earlier today, of why do we have to have anything specific for women? Why do we have to have anything specific for Black people? Why do we have to do any of this? And so you see like organizations like SHRM, the biggest human resources organization in the country, removing equity from their mission. You have organizations saying that they're no longer going to have programs that are specific to doing the very things that they said they were going to do during this George Floyd moment, and that is to gain equity, have better equality in the country, create better opportunities, stop standing in the way of opportunities, to change the dynamic between overzealous police officers who occupy neighborhoods instead of serving and protecting, right? And all of that just kind of went out the window as the narrative shifted to, one of um, xenophobia, I would say for sure, fear of foreigners. Anti-Black racism is just foundational to the United States. So anything that shows us winning, people get upset. They're like, "Whoa, wait a second. They're supposed to be enslaved people. Wait a second. They're doing
Right,
what? We're doing what? Oh no, absolutely not. Absolutely not." And
right.
so you have this really like kind of systemic, not kind of, but very much systemic and strategic movement to take away these rights. And so you start seeing more and more stories and more media, and I would say social media for sure. Whether it's fact based or not, a lot of it is misinformation, but
Yes.
it's out there, and so it starts shifting the ways in which people think about charitable giving and the programming and the kinds of events and funding that they want to where they want to put their dollars, their charitable dollars. And
Mhm,
so that's another example, right? Social media can be great for fundraising, as you know. It can also
mhm.
be detrimental to
Yes,
fundraising, as you know.
yes, yes,
So,
yes.
depending on what narrative comes out of media coverage and what type of media coverage it is, and I would argue whether it's fact based or like delusion, I call it delusions, delusional coverage. Where people are just making up stuff and just saying whatever on TikTok and X and all the things. That can also impact people's willingness to give and to contribute, and it can also impact legislation. That also impacts grants and fundraising and all the things that we can do, whether it's laws around it, policies around it. And then people start shifting, taking equity out of their mission because it's probably because their fundraising has been impacted, right? It's like, oh,
Yes.
we can't do that anymore because you have equity in there. We know when you mean equity, we read that as affirmative action, even though it's really about equity, right? Equal, like egalitarianism, something that we're supposed to already have in a democracy, but we don't. And so because people and typically those who are empowered and a fear of losing that power establish the rules, as you say, they move the goalpost. And so that's
Mhm.
what happens. They start equating things, um, and that's part of the narrative too. Equity means affirmative action for Black people or affirmative action for women. No, it just means we kind of want to be paid what other people are getting paid for doing the same job with less
We're doing the
credentials.
same job. We're doing the same job.
Right, right.
And
That's kind of like where we are. We just kind of want equity, want access. Like we're not asking for a whole bunch of stuff. Just a little, they're like, what? And so that is how narrative is tied in a good way and I would say a bad way to fundraising, and particularly fundraising culture and charitable giving.
you brought up some excellent points with that because fundraising there is an emotional reaction, right? There is a calculated reaction. I tell people all the time, in this profession, there is a science and a psychology of fundraising. There are formulas, there are things that we do, and then there are things that happen, right?
Hmm.
And George Floyd is a perfect example of the motion that happened afterwards. We're seeing in the last 48 hours a perfect example of the motion, the wave of people coming together um, to to make a statement through their dollars, through their funding, whether it's emotional, whether it's because you're a woman, I'm a woman, because I'm a male that I want to support a woman, I have a daughter. Like there are enormous amount of ways, whether it's people are moved more because of policy or the lack of policy. It is something that is enacted and it causes people to move. And what we do with the narrative in that movement individually and collective as a body, and most certainly in the professional perspective, is critical, right? Because it not only when you see the movement happen, when you see people giving, when you see people um, giving speeches and conversations and engaging on whatever level, at some point the emotion moves out. And then there has to be um, forthcoming of thought, of strategy, of
Yes.
continuous engagement. And people often will give and then fall off because the narrative changes,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Whether like you said, whether the narrative is true or not, whether there's accuracy to it or not, which is so important for us to read and to take time to listen and research and evaluate because Our dollar is a statement. Our
Yes.
dollar is powerful, right?
Mm.
The collective dollar is powerful. And there's so
Yeah,
much more I can say about that.
I have a friend who says you vote with your dollars. And I was like, yes, 100%. You vote with your
100%.
dollar, right? So you should be voting at the polls. But in addition to that, every time you make a purchase, every time you make an investment, every time you raise money and donate it to something, you are voting with your dollars. You are saying this is what matters to me. And so you should
Yes.
always be very clear on why you're giving and to whom you're giving money. Hmm.
Absolutely, absolutely. And how you steward that money, how you engage thereafter, after the moment of crisis. And I have a feeling we're going to see a lot of moments of crisis. We've been seeing them since 2020. There's something happens and we take off, and then everybody moves to the next story, the next headline, the next most printable, excitable piece, right? Be it good or bad. Um, and that level of emotional intelligence, I think, is where people have an opportunity to learn more about fundraising, learn more about the principles, the ethics, the integrity of journalism, and how the two are tied together, and the power that you have as an individual,
Hmm.
right? To take knowledge and research and learning and putting it with the power of your dollar, the power of your vote, power of your voice, the
Hmm.
power of your individuality, because it's also not about the buddy system and us being kind of like how, having a little palimony. It is really about you growing up. Right? Like growing up and having self-actualization of what you can do as an individual. It's great when we're in the crowd. It's great when it's a lot of us, but you have to know your value as an individual,
Right.
of what the amount of power you have as an individual. Here, if you give a penny, you earned that penny. You work for that penny. That penny might be the last penny you have, but you're putting a powerful amount of energy and voice to that penny that becomes one of many,
Yeah.
right? And I think that that's really where I want people to understand that yes, there's a lot that happens in the background, but we have a forefront responsibility to um, to think beyond just the moment and to really move forward with what happens after the moment, what happens to our voice, our vote, our penny after the moment of emotion. There's strategy, there's planning, there's engagement, there's activity that has to happen, right? And responsive narrative, right? Because sometimes we are just as responsible when when we get misinformation and then we go and misinform others.
Yes,
We have
absolutely.
great debates,
Yeah,
great
absolutely.
debate about it, you know?
Hmm. And I think sometimes you just have to get clarification because even when you're an expert, allegedly, I'm like, I'm not an expert. People think I am. I am not an expert, but I do very well at it. But I'm not. I know people. I work with people like you who are like amazing at it. So I can hold my own in certain areas. And then I bring in people like you to take it to the next level, to do it, to take it where it needs to go.
And I bring in
But
other
even
people.
yeah, but then yeah, exactly. You don't because you've scaled.
You
Um,
scale.
you scaled. But I think that sometimes even when you think you kind of don't. And you have to get clarification because even when talking to people, particularly about this the Kamala Harris what I call juggernaut and all of this fundraising that has happened over the last 2 days, 48 hours, as you say, it's been just amazing.
Amazing.
Right. It's just
Amazing.
amazing. So you have her
Amazing.
raising this money. You have the Republican candidate having, you got Elon Musk pledging $45 million a month to his campaign. So you have that big individual donor who's saying, I'm going to give you as much as I have to give you in order to make you president of the United States. And you have all of these things happening, but you have to know and understand what that means and what it really looks like. And that, even though the narrative is, oh, well, Kamala Harris, she was on and we talked about this. Kamala Harris, she was on, the ticket anyway, so she's gonna get all of Joe Biden's money. Not necessarily, which is why people have been organizing, some for 4 years or more. But
Hmm. Hmm.
some of us Black women stay ready. Um, because you stay ready, you ain't got to get ready. We know
That's
this,
right.
right? Which is why the organization kicked in immediately, right? The fundraising kicked in immediately because we knew and we know what that means, right? In a
Yes.
perfect world, she would get all the money. We know that's not going to happen because we live in the United States of America, which is anti-Black, anti-Asian, South Asian, um, anti-woman on a lot of fronts. I mean, it just is what it is. And so
Mhm.
you have to be able to go against those people and match those folks for dollar for dollar. So you got to be giving money constantly, pretty much, between now and November, if in fact you want a candidate who can compete in the same arena, right?
Mhm.
And so I just wanted to make that clear, when people are like, oh, I mean, I heard it on TV probably 10 different networks, oh yeah, she's just gonna inherit Joe Biden's money. And I'm like, hey, but is she really? Maybe some of it, for some PACs, political action committees, PACs, maybe she'll get some of it, but I don't know if she's gonna get all of it, and if that's the case, then there's gonna be a deficit, or there's gonna be something that needs to be made up. And so that's why you see a lot of fundraising happening around her candidacy, if in fact she gets the nomination. We still don't know that yet. Looks like it's going to happen, but we don't know. So that's why you see so much movement around it, and people are excited. As you said, they're being driven by emotion, the possibility of history, um and the fact that President Joe Biden, left the race, pulled out of the race, under, I would say, a lot of pressure, but he did
Yes.
it nonetheless, right? And so there's just a lot of emotion, whether he stayed in, donors were like, I'm not giving, right? You have people writing
Mhm.
op-eds talking about, well, I love you, but get out. And if you don't, I'm keeping my money.
Mhm.
All of those things. And so, when we think about the op-eds, we think about that. We don't think about the fact that those people are also donors who influence other people who give money. And so when you start tightening those purse strings, or you start threatening to take that away, it becomes harder and harder to accomplish whatever it is that you're after. Whether it's a presidential election, or, whether it's building a center, or whatever it is. And so you have to take those kinds of pressures that which seem to be external, but of course always lead to internal pressures, seriously, and you have to respond. And so I think that President Biden, which people aren't talking about yet, but I think will be part of his legacy, is that he, by stepping out, he also helped save a lot of money, um,
Yes.
and keep a lot of money in the Democratic space that would have probably gone elsewhere had he stayed.
That is so true. And because I want people to remember that at the beginning of this conversation, we started that conversation with talking about that it is that conversation that has to go back to the donor.
Mm-hmm.
When I give a certain way, I have to come back to you as the recipient of it and say, hey, programs changed. We're not building that building, or we're not going to be able to feed, 10,000 children. We can only feed 1,000 children, and here's why. And but your money was going towards the 10,000 children, or your money was going towards this particular candidate on a ticket. And everybody that may have given to one name on the ticket may not always want the second name necessarily to be
Mm-hmm.
the front name on the ticket. And
Mm-hmm.
so that is critical. And so when you have people that understand how the industry works, how money moves, how donations, contributions, investments move, they move in action, right? Not from an emotional space, but they move to rally and pull together. Um, we're gonna have to meet this gap. We're gonna have to meet this deficit. And I think this is a key moment for people once everything slows down, whenever that will be, for them to think about their nonprofit, their entrepreneurial space, their community space, with the dollars that they give. What happens when your traction or your momentum changes or the narrative changes? What do you do then with the penny that you committed? right? Did you give that penny for the right reasons? Are you still faithful and committed to that space for your right reason and not being, one of the birds in the flock of birds,
Mhm.
right? You're not just swept away with the tide, you go in and out with as the water flows, but really being able to get knowledge for yourself and the independence of the power that you have in that penny. And
Mhm.
like you said, it's your vote, whatever it is, whether this is an election year, election season, in any space in your life, you are giving a vote. Silence is a vote. Not giving is a vote. Not participating is a vote. Um, and people have to move their own personal perspective and dynamics, I think, with a different level of self-actualization, a different level of emotional intelligence to understand what some of these words that we'll hear being thrown out, certain buzzwords. People start picking up buzzwords, and now all of a sudden you've changed your program to match the buzzword so that you can. DEI is a perfect example. Everybody started running and started adding DEI to their programs because certain grants required you to have that word, that
Mhm.
an acronym in your language. And so if you didn't have it, you added it. Now what do you do when they're taking it away?
Right, right,
Where's your space when they're saying, okay, we can't, don't use that word anymore? Well, what is your mission? What is your goal? What is your purpose?
right.
Um, I think they're really coming to that place where it's just beyond us having to think about this moment. There's a lot to think about in this moment about how you move, how you engage. I want you to volunteer. I want you to rally. I want you to have a voice. I need you to get a voice and be sure in your voice in a manner that you're going to stay committed to
That's
as you
right.
grow, as processes change, as the narratives change, um, that will grow. What's something that you want to say to entrepreneurs right now? Because regardless of how the election turns out, we have some economic challenges ahead of us, and entrepreneurs are going to be in that space, right? Nonprofits foundations are going to be in that space because if I'm taking DEI out of my mission statement, that's not just going to change after the election. They're not going to just throw it back in, right?
Mhm.
An acronym that's coming out of their language, that's coming out of their programs. What would you say about that to the changes that we're facing now that we're going to be here for a minute and are going to be challenges in addressing those?
Well, I used to be the head of a national, actually international association for multicultural digital entrepreneurs. And I always said, um, it doesn't matter how the world shifts around you, you have to stay ready. And so what we know is that we always have to be 10 times better. We always have to be 10 times more prepared. They say twice as twice. No, no, it's like 10. It's like 10. It's not twice. It's not twice. It's like 10.
It's a-
You have to be on it, like 100% on it, constantly, consistently. There are no bad days, there are no days off. Like you got to be with it. I was joking with somebody the other day that while we're having all these meetings and organizing and doing all the things, some of my friends who don't have melanin are like, "Hey, we're going hiking. You want to go?" No, I can't go hiking. I'm trying to keep civil rights for my people. But good luck, girl. Have fun. Take pictures. Like you have to be in it to win it 110% of the time, right? And so I just encourage people to, work with your local SBDC, your small business development centers. There are resources out there. I encourage you to look for entrepreneurial centers like the Rice, the Russell Innovation Center for Entrepreneurship here in Atlanta is amazing. BIA, the Black Innovation Alliance is amazing. They're doing amazing stuff. And so you just kind of have to connect with people who are like-minded, not hustlers, because there's a difference between being a hustler and entrepreneur. Entrepreneur, you're really trying to follow the business rules, use the tools that are available and resources that are available to you to be creative and innovative and to really think long term. Nothing wrong with hustling. We're all hustling. to some extent. But
Yes.
a hustle does not make a generational, it does not make necessarily a business that will lead to generational change, i.e., generational wealth, and some type of security for those who come behind you, and leaving a business as well for those who come behind you. Um, so I always say make sure that you are aware of that, that you're looking at the SBA, their funding opportunities through those organizations, and checking with your local chamber of commerce, looking at your state chamber, and then looking at, what politicians are really lobbying for, legislation or policies that are going to impact entrepreneurs, connecting with them. If you're donating money, give it to them, and
Right.
create a pack of your own, that's about entrepreneurship, and things of that nature. So, my advice is, especially if you're an entrepreneur, woman entrepreneur, a person of color, you know, we're, we're going to have to deal with, the anti all of that in perpetuity in the United States. It's foundational,
Mhm.
I just don't foresee a day when that's going to not be a factor or an issue. So you just have to be ready, have your stuff together, have your stuff tight, and don't get discouraged. I had a big thing I was waiting on today, and it was like a no, right, rejection. But I'm just like, tomorrow's another day, so just you
Mhm.
have to keep going. Resiliency is key, and so that's what I have to say. Like, just stick with it, it will happen. It takes a long time. And I know people don't want to hear that. It takes a long time to make money. If you're doing it right, it's not going to happen overnight. But if you're doing it right, when it happens, it will be consistent.
Yes.
It will be
Yes.
consistent. And that's what you're going for, consistency. Entrepreneurs, ups and downs, but you want consistency most of the time. And that's the goal so that you can stay in the game, and retire with some money in your pocket and with something to leave somebody else.
I love the word uh, resilience that you use because I think that is the word that sums up our power right now in
Mm-hmm.
everything, in where we've been as women, as people, um, as Americans, as African Americans, as Black people, as people of color, as BIPOC people. Everybody's got a lane, and
Mm-hmm.
resilience is going to determine how you get through that process in your lane, in your area of conviction, in your area of commonality,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes in your area of just you and you alone and the isolation of that, um, and the ups and downs, because sometimes you're down and everybody else seems to be up,
Yep.
the ebbs and flows of entrepreneurship. And I love the word that you use as resilience, because as we are in this moment of heightened emotion, heightened excitement, hope, um, just fresh breath
Mm-hmm.
that has entered into in the last 48 hours in potential candidacy nomination and changes, resilience,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Resilience is
thought.
key. A friend who's writing a book, Jayla Anderson, Moore, is writing a book about. She's a Black woman. She's writing about resiliency. So, we'll have to talk about that book once it's out. But yeah, that's a big thing, just in life in general. But if you're going to be an entrepreneur, you have got to be able to rebound and to keep going. And so you just got to do it.
You got to do it. Once again, I love talking to my friend, my colleague, Dr. Nsenga Burton. Thank you for having this time, and not finding it robbery to have this common ground with me today to talk about this. If you don't know about the Burton Wire, you need to check it out because it is a mechanism of truth and honesty. And I know Nsenga does podcasts, and you'll see her on different podcasts, and you'll see her in articles and her blogs. And what I will say is that she is a forefront, a thought leader. She's gonna give it to you raw. She's gonna
Yeah.
give it to you straight, no
Yep.
chaser.
No case.
But what you will do is you will learn and gain depth in it and the sincerity of truth. She is a truth seeker, and she is a builder of entrepreneurs. And so I want to thank you for being here and being with me, um, and the Genesi team to have this conversation. And I look forward to having more conversations with this. We will take questions, we'll take answers, we'll take thoughts, we'll take points of disagreement. It's okay to not all agree, like, and then we'll come back and we'll respond to those things that we garner, that we hear from people as they watch and as they view.
Absolutely.
So thank you for being with me.
Thank you for having me.
And until next time.
Until next time.